The Queen of Scots. Chapter 1. The rise of Mary Stuart. In the year 1542, a child was born to the royal family of Scotland, a child whose destiny was entwined with power, tragedy, and historical upheaval. Mary Stuart was the daughter of King James V of Scotland and his French wife, Mary of Guise. When she was just 6 days old, her father died, leaving her as the Queen of Scotland. With her father's death, a nation was thrust into uncertainty, and a fragile young queen was left under the protection of regents. Mary's early years were spent in the French court, where she was raised in relative comfort and security. Her mother, Mary of Guise, served as regent, but her reign was always marked by the political strife between Catholicism and Protestantism that swept across Europe. The tension between Scotland's Catholic nobility and the rising Protestant influence would play a crucial role in the shaping of Mary's reign. Despite being queen by name, Mary's power was nominal in her early years, as regents controlled Scotland. Yet, she was always aware of her royal destiny, and the court of France, where she spent much of her childhood, provided her with the education, refinement, and strategy necessary to understand the complexities of monarchy. As Mary grew older, her beauty became renowned across Europe, and she was seen as a powerful pawn in the intricate dance of dynastic marriages. In the court of her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I of England, whispers of her beauty and intelligence reached the ears of kings, princes, and other nobles alike. But it was in France that her future would take shape, as an alliance with the French royal family was seen as crucial for both her survival and Scotland's security. Chapter 2. A French marriage and the path to power. In 1558, at the age of 15, Mary Stuart married the Dauphin of France, Francis, the heir to the French throne. This marriage, arranged by her mother, Mary of Guise, secured Scotland's position with France, but it also deepened the Queen's ties to the volatile political forces of Europe. The marriage was both a personal and political alliance, meant to bolster both Scotland's and France's interests in the face of rising threats from England, which was under the reign of Mary's cousin, Queen Elizabeth I. Mary was adored in France, where she was seen as a queen in waiting. Her marriage to Francis was filled with both political promise and romantic hope. Yet it also set the stage for future calamities. The death of Francis in 1560, just 2 years after their marriage, shattered Mary's world. At just 18, Mary was left a widow, a queen, without a king, and her political and personal identity was thrown into turmoil. Now, as a widow, Mary returned to Scotland. In 1561, a young queen returning to a realm that had changed in her absence. The Protestant Reformation had taken root in Scotland, and the once staunchly Catholic nation was now a battleground for religious ideologies. Her return to Scotland was marked by her determination to reclaim her power and reinstate Catholicism as the central force in Scottish politics. But the road ahead would be riddled with political intrigue, betrayal, and war. Chapter 3. The struggle for control. Mary return to Scotland was far from the peaceful homecoming she had envisioned. Protestantism, led by John Knox and his followers, had firmly established itself in Scotland, and the Protestant Reformation had redefined the political and religious landscape. The Scottish nobility, which had supported Mary's mother, Mary of Guise, was now divided, and the Protestant nobility saw the return of the Catholic Queen as a threat to their newfound power. Mary's religious beliefs put her at odds with much of her court and the Scottish nobles, although she sought to maintain a delicate balance, recognizing the importance of appeasing both Protestants and Catholics. Her Catholicism was a contentious issue. Her court was split between those who sought to maintain Catholic traditions and those who were steadfast in their Protestant faith. Despite the growing animosity between the factions, Mary attempted to foster tolerance and unity, but her efforts were ultimately in vain. One of the most influential figures in this struggle was the powerful nobleman, Lord James Stuart, the half-brother of Mary. His position as a Protestant leader gave him significant sway in the political climate of the time, and he would become one of the most prominent figures in Mary's court. Though he was initially loyal to his sister, his ambitions and his alignment with the Protestant cause would soon lead him to oppose her rule. Chapter 4. The marriage to Lord Darnley. Mary single quotes his efforts to secure her throne and strengthen her position were further complicated by her decision to marry Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. In 1565, the marriage was a politically strategic move, as Lord Darnley was a claimant to the English throne, being a descendant of Margaret Tudor, the sister of Henry VIII. This union tied Mary to the English throne more closely, and she hoped it would secure her position in both Scotland and England. However, the marriage quickly proved disastrous. Lord Darnley was vain, entitled, and power-hungry, and he sought to exert control over Mary's reign. His arrogance and desire for power led to growing tensions in the marriage. Meanwhile, Mary's continued devotion to Catholicism and her refusal to embrace the Protestant reforms caused further alienation among her court and nobles. The marriage deteriorated as Darnley's behavior grew more erratic. His desire for more influence and control over royal affairs caused strife between him and Mary. Ultimately, Darnley's frustrations led him to conspire against his wife, and in 1566, he became involved in the assassination of David Rizzio, Mary's trusted Italian secretary. The murder of Rizzio was a brutal event that shocked the Scottish court and further strained the already fragile marriage. Chapter 5. The murder of Lord Darnley. As the years passed, the tension between Mary and Darnley escalated. Darnley's behavior grew more erratic, and his ambition for power became more apparent. He sought greater influence over Mary's reign and demanded a larger role in governing Scotland. However, Mary remained focused on maintaining control of her kingdom and refusing to bow to his demands. In 1566, Darnley became involved in a plot to murder one of Mary's most trusted advisors, David Rizzio. Rizzio was seen as an obstacle to Darnley's ambitions, and his murder by a group of conspirators, including Darnley himself, would be one of the most shocking and tragic moments of Mary's reign. The assassination of Rizzio would set in motion a series of events that would further unravel Mary's position. The murder left Mary devastated and forced her to confront the betrayal of her husband. Despite her grief, she had no choice but to navigate the complex political waters of the time, and the fallout from Rizzio's death would lead to an irreversible rupture in her relationship with Darnley. Chapter 6. The abdication. In the years following the death of Lord Darnley, Mary's reign became increasingly unstable. Her political and personal life was fraught with betrayal, intrigue, and shifting alliances. The growing tensions between the Protestant and Catholic factions in Scotland were compounded by the political machinations of her enemies, both at home and abroad. By 1567, Mary's position had become untenable. The murder of Darnley, the scandal surrounding her marriage to the Earl of Bothwell, and the growing support for the Protestant cause all combined to weaken her authority. After a series of uprisings and rebellions, Mary was forced to abdicate the Scottish throne in favour of her 1-year-old son, James VI, who would go on to become James I of England. Mary's abdication marked the end of her rule in Scotland, but it was not the end of her story. Exiled from her kingdom, Mary fled to England, seeking refuge with her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I. However, this would prove to be yet another chapter in her tragic tale. Chapter 7. Imprisonment and the Final Years. Mary's arrival in England was meant to be a moment of refuge, but it quickly became a nightmare. Queen Elizabeth, wary of her cousin's claim to the English throne, and fearful of the political implications of harbouring a Catholic monarch, imprisoned Mary for 19 years. During this time, Mary's supporters continued to plot against Elizabeth's reign, and Elizabeth was faced with the constant threat of rebellion and invasion. Mary's imprisonment was marked by her resilience and her refusal to accept the reality of her situation. Yet, the more Mary became a symbol of Catholic resistance, the more dangerous she became in the eyes of Elizabeth. In 1586, a plot to assassinate Elizabeth, known as the Babington Plot, was uncovered. Mary was implicated in the conspiracy, and despite her denials, Elizabeth was forced to act. In 1587, after a trial, Mary was sentenced to death for her role in the plot. On February 8, 1587, Mary Stuart was executed at Fotheringay Castle, ending the life of one of history's most tragic and complex queens. Chapter 8. Legacy and Reflection. Mary, Queen of Scots, remains one of the most captivating figures in history. Her reign was marked by her beauty, intelligence, and grace, but also by her tragic decisions and the betrayals that led to her downfall. Her legacy is complex, and her life serves as a reminder of the dangers of power, the volatility of politics, and the fragile nature of monarchies. Though her reign in Scotland was short and tumultuous, Mary's story continues to resonate through the centuries. Her life and death serve as both a cautionary tale and an enduring symbol of the tragic cost of royalty. Her son, James VI of Scotland, would ultimately unite the crowns of England and Scotland, creating the Kingdom of Great Britain. Yet, Mary's death, so filled with sorrow and regret, cast a long shadow over the throne she could never fully claim. Mary Stuart's story is a blend of romance and tragedy, filled with dramatic twists and betrayals, a reflection of the tumultuous times in which she lived. Through the lenses of history, we see her as both a victim of fate and a queen, whose choices ultimately led to her downfall. Her legacy endures, shaping the history of Scotland, England, and the wider world. Chapter 9. The struggle for Scottish identity. As the political landscape of Scotland shifted under Mary's reign, one of the central issues was the question of Scottish identity. The tension between the old Catholic traditions and the emerging Protestant Reformation. Was not merely a religious struggle, it was about what kind of nation Scotland would become. The Catholic Queen, Mary Stuart, was seen by many as the symbol of the old order. But the growing power of Protestantism in Scotland meant that she was increasingly out of step with the aspirations of her people. Mary's court was a reflection of this religious division. Her support among the Catholic nobles remained strong, but they were increasingly outnumbered by the growing influence of the Protestant faction, led by figures like John Knox. The struggle between these two groups was not simply about theology. It was about the future of the nation. Mary's rule came at a time when Scotland was still struggling to assert its independence in the face of powerful neighbours, particularly England and France. Mary, raised in the French court, was deeply aligned with Catholic Europe, and she found herself at odds with her Protestant subjects, including many of her nobles. As queen, she made various attempts to balance the factions in Scotland, but with limited success. This internal strife created a volatile environment in which loyalty to Mary was always precarious. As Mary struggled to maintain her power, Scotland's sense of identity was in constant flux. Her efforts to reconcile the two factions, Catholic and Protestant, seemed more like attempts to appease them rather than resolve their differences. While she was adored by many for her kindness and diplomatic efforts, others viewed her as weak, unable to assert authority over the rising tide of Protestantism. Chapter 10. The Fall of the Queen. Darnley's murder. The assassination of Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, marked one of the most pivotal moments in Mary's life and reign. Darnley, whom she had married in 1565, quickly became a source of political instability. Initially, the union was meant to strengthen her claim to the English throne and solidify her position. But over time, Darnley's arrogance, jealousy, and hunger for power led to tensions that threatened to destroy everything Mary had worked for. The young Darnley, initially charming and ambitious, began to display increasingly erratic behavior. His demand for power and control within Mary's court grew as he sought to claim more influence in the kingdom. His growing frustration with Mary's political power and her reliance on advisors like David Rizzio, whom Darnley viewed with disdain, deepened their rift. In March of 1566, David Rizzio, Mary's private secretary, was brutally murdered in front of her in her chambers at Holyrood Palace. Darnley, along with several conspirators, was directly involved in the assassination. This was a shocking and traumatic event for Mary, and it marked the beginning of a period of personal and political turmoil for her. The murder of Rizzio not only devastated Mary but also further alienated her from Darnley. The tension between Mary and her husband reached new heights, culminating in the mysterious and controversial death of Lord Darnley in 1566. Darnley's body was discovered near a house in Kirkhoe Field, Edinburgh, in an unusual and suspicious condition. It was clear that he had been murdered, but the details surrounding his death remain a subject of historical debate. Some believed that Mary had been complicit in the plot. Mary's involvement in the murder, or at the very least, her failure to prevent it, created a scandal that would have lasting consequences for her reign. Relationship with Darnley was irrevocably damaged, and the questions surrounding his murder haunted her throughout the rest of her life. Chapter 11. The marriage to Bothwell. Scandal and betrayal. The murder of Darnley opened the door for yet another scandal in Mary's life. The marriage to James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell. Bothwell, a powerful and controversial figure in the Scottish court, had been implicated in Darnley's death and his subsequent marriage to Mary in 1567 was met with outrage. The circumstances surrounding their union were steeped in intrigue and suspicion. After Darnley's death, Bothwell emerged as a key player in the political landscape of Scotland. He was a prominent nobleman with considerable military power, and he seemed to hold a particular influence over Mary. The fact that Bothwell was widely believed to have been involved in Darnley's murder only deepened the scandal surrounding their marriage. Bothwell's supporters and Mary's enemies claimed that the two had conspired to kill Darnley, but there was no conclusive evidence to prove this. Despite the suspicions, Mary married Bothwell in May 1567, just 3 months after Darnley's death. This decision was viewed by many as a grievous betrayal both to Darnley's memory and to the people of Scotland. The marriage alienated Mary from much of her court, including many of her Catholic supporters, who felt betrayed by her choice of husband. The Protestant faction in Scotland also condemned the union, seeing it as an act of desperation and proof of her inability to govern effectively. The public outcry was immense, and the political fallout from Mary's marriage to Bothwell was swift and catastrophic. The Scottish nobility, already divided and resentful of her rule, now saw Mary as a weakened monarch who had made a fatal error in judgment. In June 1567, just a few weeks after the marriage, Mary was forced to abdicate the throne in favour of her infant son, James VI. Chapter 12. Exile and imprisonment in England. After her abdication, Mary fled to England, seeking refuge with her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I. However, Elizabeth, while ostensibly offering protection, viewed Mary as a threat to her own throne. Mary's claim to the English crown as a legitimate Catholic heir to Henry VIII's throne made her a focal point for Catholic conspiracies, particularly as she became the symbol of Catholic resistance against Elizabeth's Protestant rule. Elizabeth, always wary of the political implications of harbouring a rival queen, had Mary imprisoned in England. Although Mary remained the legitimate Queen of Scotland, she was treated like a prisoner in Elizabeth's court, held in a series of castles and estates under close watch. For the next 19 years, Mary languished in captivity, a prisoner of both her own fate and the shifting political currents of Europe. Her imprisonment was a time of great suffering for Mary, both mentally and physically. During her captivity, she remained steadfast in her belief that she was the rightful queen of both Scotland and England, and she never abandoned her claim to the English throne. However, Elizabeth's fear of Mary's potential to rally Catholic support in England led to constant surveillance, and Mary was never allowed to live in peace. Though she was in captivity, Mary continued to be a pawn in the game of European politics. Catholic factions within England, Spain, and France saw her as a symbol of Catholic hope, and numerous plots to free her and place her on the English throne were hatched during her imprisonment. The most famous of these plots was the Babington Plot, an assassination attempt on Queen Elizabeth, orchestrated by Catholic conspirators. Chapter 13. The execution of Mary Stuart. The Babington Plot of 1586 ultimately sealed Mary's fate. The plot to assassinate Elizabeth was discovered, and Mary's involvement, whether direct or indirect, was enough for Elizabeth to see her as a dangerous threat. Despite Mary's repeated denials of complicity, the evidence against her was enough to convince Elizabeth that her life posed a continual danger to her own reign. Mary was tried for her involvement in the plot, found guilty of treason, and sentenced to death on February 8, 1587. After 19 years of imprisonment, Mary Stuart was executed at Fotheringay Castle. Her death marked the tragic end of a queen whose life had been defined by tumult, betrayal, and loss. Mary faced her death with dignity, reportedly making a final statement of faith and signing her name as Mary R. before being beheaded. Her execution sent shockwaves throughout Europe, and her death marked a significant turning point in the history of both England and Scotland. Mary's son, James VI of Scotland, would later become James I of England, uniting the crowns of Scotland and England. However, Mary's life and death left an indelible mark on the history of the two kingdoms, a tale of ambition, tragedy, and political turmoil that would echo through the centuries. Chapter 14. Legacy of a Queen. Mary, Queen of Scots, is remembered as one of the most tragic figures in European history. Her life was defined by personal loss, political failure, and a relentless struggle to maintain her power and authority. Yet in her legacy, she became an enduring symbol of royal dignity and a tragic victim of the tumultuous political landscape of the time. Her death, though a personal tragedy, contributed to the eventual unification of the crowns of England and Scotland under her son, James VI, despite her inability to rule as she had hoped. Mary's legacy lived on through her son, who would rule over a united Britain, and whose reign would bring about significant changes to the English and Scottish political landscape. The life and death of Mary Stuart continue to captivate historians, novelists, and filmmakers. Her story remains one of love, betrayal, ambition, and the relentless pursuit of power. In the end, Mary's tragic tale stands as a reminder of the complexities and dangers of monarchy, and the cost of power in the turbulent world of 16th century Europe.